Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. Welcome to Grade 3, Lecture 3. In today's class, we're going to be discussing common blocker effects, meaning the ways in which your hand can interfere with your opponent's range to cause you to want to accept or reject a certain action. So maybe your blocker effects make you want to choose one combo for bluffing rather than another, or one combo for calling over another. We should always note that blocker effects are not going to be strong enough to trump factors like huge range advantage, causing you to want to bluff every hand in your range, for example, or something like exploitative scenarios where an opponent is massively overfolding or underfolding or just playing a long way away from equilibrium. Nevertheless, in game theory, blocker effects have a huge effect, and in some situations they can be worth enough of a percentage of the pot that they're well worth learning. They also help you keep your frequencies in check, so by learning which hands are going to be bluffable or callable in a certain spot, you can avoid overbluffing or underbluffing, overcalling or undercalling, by choosing the hands at the highest EV based on their blockers. We're going to learn a few patterns today, and we're going to concentrate on the functions of blockers and unblockers. There are actually 4 different functions that hands blockers can have, which are likely to affect whether or not that hand would like to make an investment. The more positive the functions of the blockers, the more likely we are to make that investment, even when the world is not so favourable for our range. Essentially, world favourability, a familiar concept by now, ties into blockers in a huge way. Where the world is more favourable for our range, we will not need to be as selective with our blocker functions being positive, but in worlds that are bad for us, we're going to have to care more about our blockers having positive functions. The more negative the functions of our blockers, the more likely we are to only invest in very positive worlds for our range. So here are some positive functions for bluffing. Your combo could block calls in your opponent's range, or it could unblock folds. Both are very useful because they'll shift your opponent's call frequency down the way. On the flip side, you could have a negative function for bluffing, which would be blocking your opponent's folding range. Classic examples being things like blocking ace high, where ace high is folding on the river, blocking a busted flush draw or busted straight draw, where that's folding, or maybe blocking a low pocket pair region on a higher board. Cards like 4 through 8 on a board with multiple big cards. Your combo could also unblock your opponent's calling range, meaning that they just call at a higher frequency due to having more of those hands in their range. Some other positive functions for calling could be that we block value or unblock bluffs in our opponent's range. These would be good things. And negative functions for calling would be blocking bluffs or unblocking value. Of these 8 functions, the one we're really strongly going to focus on today is going to be our combo unblocking folds. This is actually, on most boards, and particularly where there aren't flushes present on the river, a more useful metric for determining how positive your blockers are than looking at the one to the left, blocking calls. The reason for this is that it's often very tedious and difficult to actually block a call without also blocking folds when your opponent's calling range is one pair. The idea is that if you block one kicker that could go with your opponent's pair, you unblock all of the other ones at the same time. Given that your opponent's top pair combos that are calling the river are very often spread between lots of different kickers, especially in late position battles, it can be really hard to block a lot of top pair without actually having the top pair card yourself. And of course you wouldn't be bluffing with top pair. Meanwhile, your opponent's folds could have a lot more in common. Your opponent, for example, could be folding lots of busted straight draw, busted flush draws, or ace or king high combos, and all of these are likely to share a rank or suit of card. Thus, we can target them a lot more easily than we can a kicker that goes with a pair. I think unblocking folds is something that people neglect. Sometimes they go straight to trying to block the nuts or block a call in their opponent's range without thinking enough about this crucial part of game theory that's going to increase your fold equity tremendously. Let's start with a toy game. Sometimes by distilling poker down to a synthetic environment where the rules are more simple, we can actually master a concept in practice before we take it out for a test drive. So before we get to No Limit Hold'em cash games, let's talk about a game I made up called Blue Deck, Orange Deck. In Blue Deck, Orange Deck, there are 2 separate decks. One is of the blue suit, one is of the orange suit. There are 10 cards in total. The rules in this game are a bit different for you than they are for your opponent. While you get dealt 2 cards, 1 blue card and 1 orange card, but only the orange card plays. It will just be your orange card that determines your hand value in this toy game. Your opponent will be dealt just a blue card, and the blue card that they're dealt will determine their hand value. To reiterate, in this toy game, you're dealt a blue card and an orange card. Only your orange card will play, but your blue card will interfere with your opponent's hand ranking because your opponent's blue card will play. Therefore, think of orange cards as hand ranking for you and blue cards as blockers to your opponent's range. Let's say that villain is out of position in this toy game and you're in position. B100 or pot size bet is the only sizing available. We know that in the theory of this game, as I'm making it up, and this may not be the exact game theory for this toy game, I haven't solved it, my solver doesn't have an algorithm to solve blue deck, orange deck, but let's suppose that if villain checks, their range is going to be half of the combos of king, all of the combos of queen, making sense to check a mediocre hand in the middle of their range all the time, and some of the combos of jack. We're assuming here that our opponent is pure betting an ace and pure betting a 10. While I think the latter is reasonable, I'm not sure that the ace would pure bet here, given what I know about game theory, but that's okay, let's just say it does for our purposes. So this is villain's checking range. If villain bets though, then their range is going to be this, but we're not going to be concerned with this today, we're going to be more focused on the checking range. If villain checks and we bet, remembering it's a pot-sized bet, that would force our opponent to continue 50% of the time in order to make us indifferent to bluffing, and this is the goal of game theory in any neutral spot, neutral meaning that neither player has a range advantage here. So if villain checks, and we bet, and villain calls, then they're going to always call the king, and sometimes call the queen. They're not going to call the jack. The reason for this is that the king is a value beater, because we could value bet with the king here, we can't really lose. The queen is a bluff catcher, so he calls it sometimes. And the jack, being a frail hand that fails to beat bluffs, is going to always fold. We could be bluffing a jack in our range. Note that villain's blue cards don't block our orange cards in this toy game. So when he is a jack, we can still have a jack. When he is a king, we can still have a king. Villain will therefore fold the other half of the combos of queen and the remaining hand in his range, which is the jack that checked half the time to begin with. Let's introduce bluffing EV. This is an important mathematical notion, and bluffing EV is not the EV of bluffing your hand. It may sound like that's what it is, but it's not. It's actually the EV gain or loss between bluffing and checking. So where bluffing is better than checking, the bluffing EV will be positive for a hand, and when bluffing EV is positive, you should always bluff. When checking is better than bluffing, it will be negative, and when bluffing and checking have the same absolute EV, bluffing EV will be 0. Action 1. Villain checks, and this is his range. Which hand would you rather bluff with if you happen to arrive with only the 3 following combos? Remember, it's just your orange card that plays. Your blue card is simply a blocker to your opponent's range. Villain has checked half of the king, all of the queen, and half of the jack, meaning he's mixing 50-50 when dealt the king or the jack and always checking the queen, never checking the ace or the 10. What would you do when checked to here? Which of these hands has the highest bluffing EV, and which ones would you bluff and which ones would you check back? Pause the video, have a think about it, and we'll go over the answers. Okay, so the first hand here, where we have the 10, we have no showdown value at all. I'm bluffing with this hand in a neutral world. When you have a hand with no showdown value in a neutral world for your range, meaning the equity of your range and your opponent's range is similar, you're going to return an EV of 0 by bluffing against a competent opponent. If you check, you always lose, for villain is not checking their blue 10 here. If we bet, we'll get 50% fold equity, villain folding half the queen and the jack, and therefore we'll break even, getting back the same amount we put in on average. Our bluffing EV is 0. We don't have to bluff here, but we should bluff often here in order to make our opponent indifferent to calling when we have a value hand. If we refuse to bluff this hand because we said, well, there's no gain from doing so, that would be really bad, because then our value bets wouldn't be paid off as often in transparent game theory and would give our opponent a chance of exploiting us by overfolding. Needless to say, the ace is not a positive blocker. Villain doesn't get here with an ace in the first place, therefore we can't reduce their call frequency by having this card. This blue ace is what I would call an innocuous blocker. It doesn't actually have any effect because the hands it would block didn't reach this node. This is the key concept, remember this, because when we come to real hold'em in a minute, you'll be thinking, why are we looking at blue-orange? I'm not going to play this game. Don't worry, it's going to have huge implications for no-limit hold'em cash games as well. There's lots of spots where you have a card that might look like a good blocker, but your opponent didn't actually show up to the node in question with any of those value hands. Next up, we have the 10 of orange. Again, we have the nut low here, so to speak, and this time our blocker is a jack. This time, villain is going to be folding way less often, because we're going to remove the hand he's pure folding from his range. By holding the blue jack, we make it impossible for our foe to have a jack, and therefore they will call half of the queen, all of the king, and just fold the remaining half of the queen. That's 33% fold equity. When you risk 1-to-1, betting pot, with only 33% fold equity, you're going to lose money, because what's going to happen is that 1 time in 3, you're going to win 100 chips, that's the pot, that'll be your profit, but 2 times in 3, you're actually going to lose the 100 chip investment that you're making here. Overall, you're going to suffer here by 1/3 of the pot. This is not a situation where you can expect to survive bluffing this hand with negative blockers. The parallel here to No Limit Hold'em is that when you have a hand that blocks your opponent's folding range, you're going to want to refrain from bluffing it unless the world is really good for your range and fold equity is at a premium to start with. The blue jack here is the epitome of the negative blocker. It's the No Limit Hold'em equivalent of something like a blocker to a busted flush draw, or something like that. The villain is pure folding. Avoid bluffing with this hand. You're better off settling for an EV of 0 here, even though you can never win by checking. You don't have to bluff in No Limit Hold'em in spots where you have no showdown value, because you might have less fold equity than you need to break even. This depends on your blocker effects. Finally, on to the jack with the 10 kicker here. This hand is pretty interesting. The fold equity here is the same as it was in the first case, because we have the blue 10, and that's actually a non-blocker. The blue 10 at first glance looks like a negative blocker. It looks like the kind of card you'd want your opponent to hold, but the idea is that in the node in question, villain doesn't arrive in this decision point with the 10 anyway, because they would have bluffed that at full frequency in our toy game model. Therefore, the 10 and the ace are identically useless and irrelevant in terms of what they block. They're not negative things, but they're not positive either, because villain's range for arriving on this node just contain neither. The main difference between this hand and the top hand is not the blue card is a moot point, it's actually the orange card. When we have the jack, we have a little bit of showdown value. If you can check and win 12.5% of the time, that's how often you're going to win with the jack here, because effectively you're chopping against 1/4 of the opponent's range. That's when they hold the blue jack, which you unblock. That's the same as winning against 1/8 of villain's range, chopping against 1/4, same thing. We win a little bit here by checking, and because the EV of betting pot as a bluff, we would be turning our hand into a bluff, is just 0 still. We never get called by the jack, we never chop in those cases. Our bluffing EV is negative. But the reason our bluffing EV is negative this time is that checking is positive and bluffing is 0. Contrast that to the hand above, where checking was 0 and bluffing was negative. Overall here, what we're seeing is that the blocker effect has a huge effect on our EV in a toy game where ranges are so narrow. In the real world, in No Limit Hold'em, where ranges are wider and the blocker is just going to interfere with a little patch of villain's range, you won't see swings with this bigger percentage of the pot, but you can do in some highly filtered 3-bet and 4-bet pot situations. Overall though, we've found that blocker effects tend to swing the EV of bluffing one hand compared to another by a maximum of about 4 or 5%, but this may be higher in spots where blockers are more influential due to ranges being narrower, as I say. Let's move on from the toy game and get back to the real world. At this point in the video, we're going to introduce a model for selecting your bluffs based on the extent to which they unblock or block your opponent's folding range. Sometimes we reach a spot with a choice of bluffing different candidate bluffing hands. These are hands that don't have showdown value. Firstly, we may have a hand that blocks a certain amount of calls, let's call that X calls, in our opponent's range, and Y-1 folds. What this means is that the hand blocks an average amount of calls in villain's range, but less than the average amount of folds. This is a good hand to bluff because our opponent is folding more often on average when we hold category A than when we hold B or C. Category B is a hand that blocks the same number of calls as A. X calls, again we're keeping this X factor constant so that we can compare the amount of folds these combos block. In the real world, hands may block different amounts of calls and different amounts of folds, and you may have to compute both, but for now we're going to keep it simple. Category B blocks Y folds, which is the average amount of folds that the average hand in our range blocks in our opponent's range. A is better than B to bluff with because A blocks the same amount of calls in villain's range but less folds, meaning that villain is folding more often on average when we hold A than when we hold B. C is a hand that has negative blockers to villain's folding range, meaning it really starts to block it heavily. C blocks the same number of calls as A and B, again keeping this X factor constant, but the Y factor, how many folds the hand is blocking in villain's range, is higher. So when you're holding a hand of category C, villain is going to be folding less often. A classic category C hand board where flush draw has missed would be blocking the nut busted flush draw or the king high busted flush draw. Blocking lower ones may be less relevant. There are loads of other examples of this point as well though. A has the highest bluffing EV, blocking the least amount of villain's folds. B is middling and average, and C blocks more villain's folds and therefore fold equity is lower, decreasing the bluffing EV. The higher the fold equity, the higher the EV of bluffing generally. In a highly unfavourable world, what's going to happen is that if fold equity is average, because we hold a hand like B that has average blockers, it's going to be a losing proposition to bluff. Villain is going to have no shortage of really good continues in these worlds, and the only hands that are actually going to be close to break even are going to be hands with favourable blockers. If you arrive on a run out, a texture, or a situation where you feel like your range is doing really badly based on the combination of the preflop ranges, the action sequence, and the way the board is run out, you will want to only bluff with your best caliber bluffs. And these, with respect to this Y factor, are hands that block the least folds possible in your opponent's range. Everything else you should give up with. In worlds that are a bit less unfavourable, but still bad for you, there will be some hands that swing positive. So your best blocker hands, in this context ones with Y-1 blocker factor, meaning blocking less folds than average, are going to be profitable, but nothing else is really going to be good enough removal-wise to bluff with. In a neutral world, which is a very common scenario for things like continuously aggressed spots, stuff like double barrel, triple barrel, check raise and then barrel off. These worlds tend to be quite neutral, but it depends on run out. So when you're aggressing in a world like that, you normally do have hands in your range that you have to bluff with because they are clearly winning. And these will be your category A hands that have positive removal effects with respect to not blocking folds. They block Y-1 folds, whatever that means. This doesn't have to be Y-1 combos. It's just a scale to compare A to B and B to C and A to C. It's just a scale. In these neutral worlds, you'll sometimes be able to bluff category B hands as well. In fact, in a neutral world, by definition, the EV of bluffing an average caliber bluffing candidate is 0. Therefore, the EV of bluffing category A hands is winning and C is losing. So you shouldn't bluff C in a neutral world. But in a slightly favourable world, things start to shift. These worlds tend to come into existence when one player condenses and the other player polarizes and then checks. For example, when button c-bets the flop against big blind and big blind calls, turn goes check check, and the run out comes down either blank or in a way that benefits hands that had a reason to hang around and call flop, big blind is going to gain a range advantage and will be in at least a slightly favourable and sometimes even a very favourable world. In slightly favourable worlds, the player with the range advantage should always bluff when they don't have showdown value unless their blockers are horrible. The only hand that actually gets close to break even for bluffing, everything else is winning, is going to be category C, because although the base fold equity for a slightly favourable world is above what you need it to be to break even, when you have a hand with category C blockers and you block more folds, your fold equity is lowered again, and this may make it closer to break even. This isn't a perfect scale, but it's very important to see which factors determine when and why you can bluff. Finally, we have highly favourable worlds. These tend to arise either when you have someone filtering their range by calling, the other person checking back, just like in the slightly favourable world, but also these can arise when you have a pre-flop raiser who doesn't bet yet and makes it to the river. They've delayed their c-bet twice basically, and they've maintained that range advantage that they got from pre-flop. So if I open cutoff, you call big blind, and the flop comes queen deuce deuce 7-3, and it goes check 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 all the way to the river, and you check to me on the end, I'm going to be in a highly favourable world for my range. My range preserved its strength, though it didn't preserve its nuttedness, but your range is very capped as well now, and so I have to bluff everything. It doesn't matter if I block your folding range. It doesn't matter what my blockers are. The base fold equity for a highly favourable world is just so high that even if I have a category C hand, a hand that blocks more folds than average, I still have to bluff. This is a really useful metric, and although it is abstract and not directly applicable when you sit down to play poker later today or tomorrow or something, it will change the way you think about bluff selection. By first identifying which kind of world you're in, and then thinking about the blocker properties of your hand with respect to unblocking folds, you'll have a really good idea of which combos you should be bluffing. Yes, the X factor of the hand, how many calls it blocks, can also be relevant, as we'll see. But as I say, due to the varied nature of kickers that go with pairs that people tend to call river bets with, it's quite hard to block them in a uniform way. This changes on flush runouts and any other runout where one key card is going to be a super powerful blocker, but for the most part, blocking or unblocking folds has more of an effect on fold equity than blocking calls, because it's possible to do so in a more uniform way. If we can determine roughly which world we're in, range versus range, and in your solver, you can always look at range versus range EV, which is a very good guide if you see, for example, that the out of position player is entitled to 68% of the pot in the solver. It will mean that that player is in a highly favourable world and will want to bluff every single combo regardless of X factor and Y factor, regardless of all removal properties. And if we can determine whether our hand is A, B or C with respect to blocking folds, that's the Y factor, then we can choose between bluffs which don't seem to excel in any obvious way at blocking calls, All too often, a student will say, I don't block his calling range and give up there, but sometimes a hand that's especially good at unblocking folds is a profitable and mandatory bluff in many of these worlds, as long as it's not highly unfavourable. We're going to look finally at a real life example. I'm sure you've been waiting patiently for a hand of No Limit Hold'em to come down in this lecture, so here we go. Big blind plays against hijack here. Check calls the flop and the turn. Hijack, quite rightly using a big bet on this flop, is fine, and then an overbet on the turn is a principled choice, given the large polarization advantage for the in-position player on this node. And then on the river, there's about a B133 left here as an all-in, and hijack can either do that or check. First question, how favourable is this world for hijack? Have a quick think about it, write something down. Well, this world is fairly close to neutral. After the big blind checks the river, the problem for hijack is, although hijack does have a massive nut advantage and this boosts a lot of their EV, they're getting a great conversion rate between equity and EV here because their nutted hands are just completely unrivaled and entitled to loads of the pot and implied odds. But this is only a slightly favourable world because the equity shifts quite strongly in big blind's favour after the overbet and call on the turn. The reason for this is that hijack's range is richer in combos like semi-bluffs that have all bricked on the Deuce of Hearts river, whereas big blind's range has not really been hurt by this card, and actually the condensed holdings, the medium strength hands like good Jack X and King X, which form the bulk of big blind's calling range, have actually got stronger. We saw this phenomenon explicitly back in grade 2 when we compared a very wet river to a very dry one. And we found that after turn overbets, it tends to be straight completing cards that are really great for the in-position player because these are folded by big blind on the turn, whereas blank cards tend to favour the passive player who called the turn bet. Next up, I'd like you to examine the following hands with respect to their Y factor. If you want, you can think a little bit about X factor in some of these cases as well. X factor, to remind you, is how many calls in the opponent's range you're blocking. So if you're a hijack here, you can think a bit about that. But what I'd like you to pay particular attention to is the Y factor, how many folds you're blocking or unblocking. I've extended the scale here to compare all 5 of these hands with each other. For example, the most average hand here will have the Y factor of just Y, meaning it blocks an average amount of folds. The worst hand to bluff with here will be called Y+2, because that hand will block more folds than average by far, and Y-2 will be the hand that blocks the least folds. You can pretty much make your decisions in spots like this looking solely at Y factor. You don't actually need to focus that much on blocking calls here, but you might want to a little bit just as a bonus to this exercise. Okay, assign a label to each of these hands, and when you're ready, we'll go over the answers. Let's go. Queen 8 of hearts is actually the best Y factor hand here, coming in at Y-2. There isn't really a lot of 8x or Queen X in our opponent's folding range here. King Queen is a hand that we'll like to call because it's possible we're value betting the same sort of hand. So King Queen is a good one to block. That's actually an X factor, positive X factor thing. And with X factor, you actually want it to be +2, not -2, because you're blocking something good, not something bad. And the 8 is a very useful card for just completely unblocking folds. What possible combo of 8x is your opponent calling the turn with here and then folding the river? Basically nothing. King 8 is actually a combo that may call the river a bit more often than most other King X because the 8 in turn unblocks our bluffs. Remember, we talked about some of the positive blocker effects you can have for calling bets and bluff catching, and you want to block folds and unblock bluffs. That's the X factor and Y factor respectively of the facing bets world. The 8, in a kind of long-winded roundabout way, is a really good card to have because villain will call a decent amount when they have King 8 here and not make it to this spot with any other 8s. It would be erroneous to say the 8 blocks pocket 8s, therefore it's bad, because of course pocket 8s couldn't arrive on this node. It could barely call the B75 on the flop, let alone the overbet on the turn. Make sure you're always considering whether your blocker is relevant given the range your opponent has landed on the node in question with. Ace-6 of diamonds is a horrible looking hand because the big blind is going to be incentivized to call diamond draws that are ace high on the turn. The reason for that is twofold. Firstly, these hands are just incredibly powerful, but secondly, they're also going to have showdown value and actually be bluff catchers. This is a Y+2 hand, and it's one that you should certainly give up unless the world was more favourable than this. This is basically a neutral to slightly favourable world, so these combos are clearly not going to be bluffable. The 10-9 of clubs is an average hand. While we have no diamonds, and we're unblocking that region of our opponent's folding range, giving us some decent Y factor there, the problem is that king 10 and king 9 are actually closer to hands our opponent is folding than the 8 or the 3 of ace 3 of spades would be. So when villain is calling a king X here, they're all actually equivalent. King 3, king 4, king 8, king 9, king 10. They all have the same ranking against our polarized range because they lose to all of our value bets but beat all of our bluffs. They're all just bluff catcher family hands. But king 10 and king 9 are going to fold more because we bluff a lot with these cards. We just naturally have a lot of 10x and 9x in our range here, and thus a lot of our bluffs contain these cards. That's a really difficult thing to figure out in game. I totally accept that this is quite convoluted and difficult to put your finger on while you're playing. But in general, cards like an 8 are just going to completely stay out of the way of your opponent's folding range here, whereas a 10 or a 9, it's going to be less clear. If you'd bet turn smaller and villain could have got here with something like ace queen, ace 10, queen 10, then these cards would be even worse. The ace of diamonds, 10 of spades is not quite as bad as the ace of diamonds, 6 of diamonds because it doesn't block as many holdings such as 6-4 or king 6 of diamonds, which are frequent folds on this spot. That said, the ace of diamonds is still the worst diamond to hold, and in an only slightly favourable world for your range, you're not going to want to bluff such a combo. This wouldn't be as big a blunder as bluffing ace 6 of diamonds, but it's something you want to avoid. Ace 3 of spades, this is a hand that has decent Y factor. The ace is not really going to block any folds here. It's not going to block many calls either, although villain could possibly call with ace jack here at some frequency. I think that's the jack they arrive on this node the most with, but we'll explore this in a second and see if I'm right. But ace 3, the good thing about this hand is that the 3 is very innocuous. It's not going to interfere with big blind's folding range much at all. Therefore, we're pretty happy to go ahead and bluff with this hand. The ace isn't going to block many folds either because hands like ace queen, ace 10 aren't really going to be able to make it to this node very frequently at all. When we look at villain's folding range here, we can see that the king X that folds the most tends to be king 10 or king 9. We see that king queen calls way above average frequency for king X, and thus that's a hand we want to block. X factor is going to tell us block that hand when bluffing. And hands like king 3, king 5, king 6 call at a more normal kind of frequency. The 3 is actually a decent card to hold because we're blocking a king that tends to call more often than not. To just go over this in more detail and have a look at this in terms of the percent pot that these hands are actually costing or making here, Queen 8 of hearts is netting almost 5% of the pot here by bluffing. That's pretty huge considering that we've overbet the turn in big bet flop and that the pot's already very large. This blocks only one frequent fold, which is king 8, and king 8 isn't even folding that frequently. It's actually calling more than most of the other king X if you scan horizontally down the king X region of villain's range for facing this triple barrel. Ace 3 of spades, not as good a hand to bluff with, but still clearly winning, coming in at 1.24% pot, basically break even, but this will add up long term. This is a hand that, all else being equal, you're going to want to go ahead and jam the rest with. You are blocking a hand like ace of spades, jack of spades, and ace of spades, jack X, but these hands are sometimes bluff catching river, so it's not even that bad. It's not that important how often a hand calls compared to how often it folds. What's key here is how often a hand folds compared to the rest of the hands in the range. That's what's going to skew villain towards folding more or less often than average. Given that we're overbetting here, villain is folding a bit more than half of their range, and so the norm fold equity here for villain's combos is something just over 50%. When you see a hand like king 3 actually calling more than 50% of the time, then you know that that hand is more of a call than a fold compared to average hands. Why, for the 10-9 of clubs, going to be a fairly neutral hand coming in at basically 0% pot and an optional bluff. You can see the numbers are not exactly zero there, that's just due to accuracy in the sim, it's noise, we don't have to worry about it too much. But this combo is going to be blocking, in theory, the more frequent folds of king 10, king 9. In practice, things may not go this way. You may get opponents who just always call a king or always fold a king depending on how they're feeling. In these cases, your blockers like having the 10 or the 9 as opposed to the 3 or the 8 are not going to be quite as relevant because there's just not going to be that discrepancy between king 10 and king 8 that you see there in Solverland. Very strong opponents may think in that way, but I think it's very bizarre to get lost down the rabbit hole of blockers in this case. I want to show you what things look like objectively, but feel free to ignore this if you're playing against someone who doesn't prefer king 10 as a fold to king 8, who doesn't call king 3 more than king 6. These things become irrelevant quite quickly in the real world. They're not the heart of poker theory, they're just the fine details. This hand is losing overall. The 10 isn't great for blocking the more likely folding kings, and the ace is bad for blocking the busted flush draws, ace queen, ace jack, etc. So this is one that we want to give up. And of course, this is the worst one, losing you 5 to 6% of the pot if you do choose to bluff here, blocking a lot of different pure folds. Let's look at a spot on the river where we have a double delayed stab opportunity or probe bet opportunity. Frequently, villains' calls will not have very much in common with one another when we're bluffing. The hands we're getting called by will be quite heterogeneous. They will not have uniform qualities because the pairs that call you, or the ace high that call you, depending on the strength objectively of those hands, are going to have all sorts of different kickers and a lot of spots. But by contrast, their folds will very often have a lot in common. These can share similar cards like ace high, king high, busted draw, busted straight draw, flush draw, etc. So when bluffing, it makes sense, as we've said, to focus heavily on blocking or unblocking villains' folds rather than their calls. Here are some questions. In this spot, where small blind is opened, been 3-bet by big blind's polarized range and called, and then it's checked all the way to the river and small blind has this delayed stab opportunity, what does the big blind's folding range look like if we bet here in the following spot, and how would you structure a bluffing range to try to unblock that to have the best Y factor possible? Pause the video, have a think about it, jot down some answers, and let's go. Assuming you've done that, villain will be folding mostly ace-x and king-x on this node, although they will be calling some ace-x hands too. King-x is a good example of a pure folding combo in the big blind's range. But since we aren't bluffing with ace-x anyway, because that's right, it's too high showdown value, the main goal here is to avoid bluffing with hands that block the big cards. That means trying to not block the kickers that would go with the ace-x and king-x. Since this is a 3-bet pot, the ace-x and king-x kickers tend to be bigger in nature on average because people 3-bet more Broadway hands than they do random ace-x, although big blind does 3-bet a mixture, having quite a polarized range in position here. You could argue at first glance that king-queen is a good bluff because it blocks king-jack and queen-jack, but these are basically no combos. The problem here is that villain doesn't actually have these hands much because firstly they don't 3-bet them a ton pre-flop, and secondly they bet the turn a lot of the time if not the flop with these holdings. The folding range, which is much more patterned and abundant than these few nutted hands, is what really matters, and that's mostly going to be king high, ace high. In this situation then, small blind has to concoct a strategy that takes favorability into account and favors bluffing with hands that have more positive Y factor, which actually conversely means having a negative number next to the Y factor, hands that block less folds than average. How favorable is the spot for small blind? It's fairly favorable. The small blind player doesn't have anywhere near as much trash as big blind does, because big blind is just 3-betting a ton of hands like king 8 offsuit, ace 4 offsuit, and reaching this node quite frequently. Meanwhile, the small blind has a bit of a bulkier, bigger range, and thus is doing okay in a spot where ace-x, a common hand for them, has become stronger. The reason ace-x has become stronger here is that it's basically just surviving on a bricky texture that's hard to hit, that's not being outdrawn by numerous lower unpaired cards, because there are very few unique cards for unpaired hands to hit here in this texture. This means that we will bluff, being in a slightly favorable world, all of our class A hands. These are ones with Y-1 factor for unblocking folds. We're going to be unblocking a lot of folds with Class A. Class B is going to block a normal amount of folds, and we will bluff these too because the world is slightly favorable, but we'll stay away from most Class C hands because the world isn't very favorable. We're not in such a great situation that we can bluff anything here. When we look at our strategy, we can see that one of the most common hands that gets bluffed all the time is a holding like pocket sixes. Sixes or fours, which are counterfeited pairs, note that these hands do not have any showdown value, they're not value bets. These are great because the blockers are so innocuous that you just unblock folds. These are Y-1 hands because they just don't interfere with villain's folding range. Villain is very rarely making it to this node with a 6 or a 4 in their hand and then folding. Note that 5s here is a value bet, so it's kind of hiding among the bluffs there, but it's a value bet. Class B and C bluffs tend to be things with bigger cards. When we have a holding such as Queen 10, note that we block a lot more villain's folding range by interfering more with that Broadway region. We're not blocking a ton of Jack-X with the Queen here because Queen-Jack just doesn't arrive on this node very often in this way. It's very frequently going to be betting turn if it didn't see bet flop in the first place. Consequently, we don't arrive in this world with enough favorability to just pure bluff these hands. They're only break even. And of course, if we always bluff a break even hand bluff, we end up over bluffing in GTO. So we stay away from that. King X here isn't really doing great by checking. It's not that this hand has a lot of showdown value, but it has a very negative blocker, because if we bet, the king is what villain is folding the most. These hands may have a shred of showdown value though if villain checks back a hand like King Queen here. So we could actually refer to these as tier 4. Look at the difference unblockers make here for B75. While a hand like Pocket Fours is coming in at plus 6.33% pot for bluffing because it just does such a great job of unblocking villains' folding range, a hand like Queen 10 is only making 3.47% of the pot. For some reason this hand is actually making some money by checking, and that's why it doesn't bet all of the time. I guess villains not only checking back some King X here, but maybe some Queen 10 themselves. Let's look at a spot that's highly unfavourable now, like a very depressing world for the range of the would-be bluffer. When it checks through to the river in a 2-bet pot, the out-of-position caller is usually going to be a huge disadvantage. The mildly condensing actions of each player, that's the checks that lead to the river, leave the big blind caller from pre-flop, leave their range disadvantage completely in place. Because of course, when the raiser checks back on the flop in the turn, the thing that player forfeits is not the range advantage, but the nut advantage. But when both players check multiple times, both ranges become somewhat capped. In this scenario, and granted I have picked an incredibly bad board here for the big blind player's range, a very good board for the under the gun player's range, this situation by and large is just going to be bad for the out of position player. Check on a flop where under the gun has quite high equity, but is not really profiting too much from a nut advantage here. The thing with Ace-6-5 is there's a lot of 2-pair sets and top pair in the big blind's range, and these hands are all going to do very well against the formerly nutted pocket pairs like kings, queens, etc. from pre-flop. So this isn't actually a board that under the gun has to bet all of the time, although you will see people bet all of the time on this board. Under the gun's check back here is pretty sensible. They can build a checking range here, but maintain a big equity advantage when they check back. Under the gun is not building a checking range on this board because they think it's a bad world for range, but because the opponent's a bit too polar for us to want to bet all the time. On the turn it goes check again. There are a lot of hands here like 10s, jacks, queens, king x, bad ace x that want to check at some frequency here, and some of the air and under the gun's range will delay all the way until the river. The king of diamonds is basically the final nail in the coffin for the big blind player's equity, giving them absolutely no shot at outdrawing the under the gun player's cards and making the king even more powerful. And the king, of course, was a card that under the gun held the monopoly on after the pre-flop and flop action skewed their range towards that card. Not only has the under the gun player retained the range advantage in a major way here, but they've also gained a nut advantage on the river by just having a king often in this configuration. A king is just the sort of hand that will open under the gun, check back flop, check back turn, and then hit trips in the river. That's basically what's happened here a lot of the time. Highly unfavourable world. 27% pot entitlement for the out of position player's range here for the big blind. That's terrible. And now big blind must give up all but the very best bluff candidates because the average fold equity is very low, and so it takes a special blocker effect, a really good Y factor, and maybe even some X factor in this spot to make bluffing a good idea. I'd like you to think about the following exercise quite carefully and compare the following hands. 10-9 of diamonds, 10-9 of spades, and 7-5 of hearts. What do we think about the prospects of these hands in terms of Y factor? You can think about a bit of X factor here as well, how many calls you block or unblock, and which of these would you bluff and which ones would you not? Bearing in mind that you have to be very careful here and that any misstep towards bluffing just because you feel like it is very quickly going to constitute punishable over bluffing on the big blind's behalf. Pause the video, have a think, and we'll go over the answers as always. Let's do it. 10-9 of diamonds is a hand that you should never bluff. The diamonds are particularly bad, and let me guide you to the reason for this. What suits does villain's air usually have when it checks all the way to the river? Is it spades, or is it something else? That's right, villain's air is usually something else. Spade draws tend to bet the turn at higher frequency than the other air hands in villain's range. Therefore, a hand like 10-9 of diamonds is going to constitute a familiar air holding for the under the gun player. There'll be hands that share these cards all over the place. There'll be hands like Queen 9 of diamonds, Queen 10 of diamonds, Jack 10. There may even be some offsuit combos as well, depending on how wide the player is calling pre and what the open sizing was from under the gun pre-flop. When action happens passively and it goes check, 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 check all the way to the river, you typically want to have the busted flush draw, because the busted flush draw doesn't constitute air very often in that passively played node. The busted flush draw would exist much more frequently if under the gun had bet flop and bet turn. We're not saying they don't exist, just that they're not as common. With 10-9 of spades, we see that although this is still a hand that you shouldn't bet, and one reason why you shouldn't bet either 10-9 of diamonds or 10-9 of spades as a family of hand ranking is that they block 10s and 9s, which are common check, check, fold hands here. But the reason that you particularly shouldn't bluff diamonds but could maybe bluff spades without as severe an EV loss is of course that spades unblocks more of your opponent's folds. It has a better Y factor. 7-5 of hearts doesn't win by checking. It's actually the kind of hand that may look like showdown value, but it's really not. Note that the EV for checking this hand is 0. Given that bluffing is also 0, ignore the very tiny difference there between the numbers. The solver's not sure yet whether these are actually different or not at this accuracy, which is why it's just bluffing sometimes. It thinks it's break even. That is all down to removal. It's down to Y factor, and the reason you want to bluff this hand is mainly that villain will not be making it to this node as the under the gun player with a 7 and then folding. Not only is pocket 7s going to bet the flop, being more vulnerable and more benefiting from fold equity at higher frequency than 9s or 10s, but also villain will just not have a card like a 7 or a 5 in their range here very often, and if they do have a 5 like 5-4 or 6-5, they're going to call the river, though 6-5 would have probably bet the flop. Overall, it's much better to have these low innocuous cards that leave the bigger pocket pairs and unpaired region unblocked than it is to block them with a card like a 10 or a 9, which is a bit too relevant to villain's range and going to remove some of those folds. In practice, this is a spot you can get very wrong if you're not careful, and when you take a loose beginner and put them in this situation, their natural inclination is to overbluff. The reason for that is that they've already led way too much of their ace-x on the turn, not realizing they can slow play there at a low urgency spot, see grade 2 for that, lecture 5 on the out of position game, and they're going to sometimes feel compelled to bluff the river because it's the only way they can win the pot. But bluffing the river here with 10-9 of diamonds is a bit like running into a burning building to retrieve your wallet because it's the only way you can get it back. Just because that's the only way you can try and get your wallet back doesn't make it correct to risk your life running into a burning building. I don't think any of us would really value the bank cards that we could just replace that highly. Let's move on to a situation where we're actually looking at one strategy compared to the other in parallel. This really lets us see how our opponent's folding range affects what hands we want to be bluffing. Let's observe how our bluffs in this case are mainly chosen so as to unblock folds, not to block calls. Again, we'll use the previous situation. Under the gun versus big blind. We have villain's reaction to the B150 on the river on the left here. Remember, this is a probe bet from big blind after check, 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 check. Makes sense to build this sizing, because if you are going to have a king here, you're going to want to bet really big. If you've slow played a boat, you're going to want to bet really big. Or slow played a set that became a boat, I should say. And our B150 strategy as big blind is going to be really related to what under the gun is folding. So you have under the gun's folding range, the B150 on the left, and big blind's resulting bluffs on the right. Well, betting range on the right. There's some value bets in there as well, as you can see. The value bets for B150 are the very rare shred of 5s and 6s that have reached this point, and also the King X that's going to be going for value here. It's mostly built around that. These hands are very high equity, so they're allowed to be 150. The bluffs, meanwhile, are mostly avoiding the middle band. You don't see any hands coloured in here around the 10x, 9x, 8x sort of region. And the reason for that is just that these hands are blocking folds at the highest frequency. We see bluffs come in two shapes and sizes. One, cards at the bottom that just don't interfere with any of villain's folds, like 6-4. Note that 6-4 isn't an amazing bluff because it blocks loads of calls. Villain doesn't actually have a ton of 6x here. Maybe it does block some calls like 6-7 suited that are opened by under the gun at a low frequency only. When it comes to hands like Queen Jack suited and Jack 10 suited, the idea with these holdings is that they are blocking King Queen, King Jack, Ace Queen, Ace Jack at the highest frequency, though Ace Queen may pure bet by the turn, and therefore they have really good X factor without having as much Y factor. Again, villain will be bluffing hands like gutters themselves previously at some point at quite a high frequency, so like the spade draw, these hands don't remove that many folds compared to something like 10-9. The final point here could be that villain may be folding the river more often with 10s and 9s than they would be with something like queens or jacks. Because of this, this will make us more inclined to bluff with Queen Jack and less inclined to bluff with 10-9. As we can see, big blind has to be really careful, and their Y factor is derivable by looking at the opponent's strategy or even just imagining it if you don't have a sim to hand. How to do this in game? Quickly ask yourself, what are villain's most likely folds here and do I block them? Because in a world that's so bad, you better make sure you block as few as possible before you consider bluffing this spot. So at all costs you want to avoid hands that block these underpairs but don't block the broadways. That's how we instantiate this pattern in this hand example. Finally, before we wrap up, let's cover a fallacy. It isn't really a Carrot Poker Skill lecture without doing this, as you know. Many players massively overemphasize the extent to which our cards can meaningfully and reliably block the best hands possible in villains' range. Always thinking about the nuts is a natural inclination when we first start out in poker, and it may even persist through to the point where we reach grade 3 level. It's natural to want to avoid running into that massively powerful, scary hand that's going to beat us. These hands are not useful to block when bluffing in many nodes because A, they may form an insignificantly small part of the opponent's range to begin with, or may just not reach the node at all. B, they may contain cards on the board which we wouldn't be bluffing anyway, so in order to block something like a set, it might be pretty impossible because we wouldn't be bluffing with a pair in the first place. And thirdly, these may have a wide scattering of sidecards across their combo distribution, which makes them pretty unblockable, or at least makes it the case that we can only block very small regions of these hands at one time. Nuts obsession, reject it, make sure that you think about what your opponent's folding, not just the best hands that they can have. For homework, I would like you, this time, to analyse 3 hands in the node of single raise pot, out of position delayed probe opportunity, where the runout is not super wet and crazy. The idea here is that I want you to practice hands that are not favourable worlds and get you to keep your bluffs under control by favouring mainly hands with very good Y factor, meaning Y-1 or Y-2. These hands are going to be things that don't interfere with your opponent's folding range, and you will want to avoid, unless the board is super wet, and I'm saying don't use those textures, you'll want to avoid the idea of trying to block the nuts. In this node, your opponent's not getting there with nutted hands, generally speaking. You just want to make sure that you leave their folds intact. This spot, to reiterate, is a situation in a single raise pot where it's checked all the way to the river, and then big blind has the chance to lead for the first time out of position. When you do this, try and jot down what you think the favourability of the node is, then check this in your solver by looking at the out of position EV. Jot down the class of your hand as a bluff with respect to its Y factor, its propensity to unblock folds. Is it Y+1, Y-1, or Y? If you want, you can even add +2 and -2 if you want to make the scale bigger. And what should you do? Should you bluff, mix, or check? Then run it in the solver and note any inaccuracies in your analysis. Jot down some areas in which you can improve. Have fun with this task, and I'll see you back here for lecture 4. Good luck at the tables. I hope this one's been useful, and I hope you find it helps your bluff selection in game. Bye for now, guys.